Good afternoon. I'm Domenico Grasso, Provost of the University. I'd like to thank you all for being here this afternoon. I'd like to welcome President Asanas and Eleni Asanas as well, and distinguished visitors, faculty, staff, and students to our first Thought Leaders Series event for the new academic year. I want to especially thank Ann Artis, the Senior Vice Provost for Graduate and Professional Education here and the Director of our Interdisciplinary Humanities Research Center, for her very diligent and hard work in bringing Dr. William Adams to campus today. In addition, I'd like to thank George Watson, Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, for his significant investment in the humanities. We're very grateful for his leadership and vision for the Arts and the Humanities program here at UD. Today, I have the honor of introducing Dr. William Bro Adams, Chairman of the National Endowment for the Humanities. We are delighted that he is spending time here in Delaware on a 3-day visit and took time out to spend a significant portion of that here at the university. He's our first speaker in the 2016-2017 academic year Thought Leaders Speaker Series, which happens to fall on the 50th anniversary of NEH. This series began 2 years ago as part of our strategic planning initiative under the supervision of Charlie Reardon, Deputy Provost for Research and Scholarship. He and the rest of the committee have brought some fantastic speakers to campus as part of our effort to participate in the great debates that, of course, define our times and inspire discussion about the issues and opportunities in the field of higher education. As you know, Chairman Adams is at the helm of one of the nation's leading funders of the humanities and scholarship and public humanities programming. As he looks forward toward the organization's next 50 years, he is visiting every state in the country to share his vision about the opportunities that lie ahead. We are fortunate to be one of several Delaware organizations to benefit from recent NEH funding. Within the last 4 months, UD has received 2 major NEH awards. One that supports a Colored Conventions Project, a digital research collection that is directed by Gabrielle Foreman, the Ned B. Allen Professor of English, and this project was featured in the New York Times just a couple of weeks ago. We are also one of only 3 institutions in the country to receive the highly competitive Next Generation Humanities PhD Implementation Grant. And I want to thank again Ann Artis for leading this effort. This newest grant will support interdisciplinary African American public humanities training at the doctoral level and train students for a broad range of careers in and beyond the academy. And I'd like to thank Erica Armstrong Dunbar, the Blue and Gold Professor of History, who will direct the Next Generation Initiative. The state of Delaware is truly fortunate to have benefited from NEH funding. The Delaware Humanities Forum, Hagley Museum and Library, Winterthur, and Delaware State University have also received NEH grants in an effort to promote humanities statewide. We really cannot thank NEH enough for its support of cultural heritage work here in the first state. Tomorrow, Chairman Adams will visit Winterthur, our stalwart partner in American Material Culture program. This program was established in 1952, and at that time was the first graduate program dedicated to the interdisciplinary study of material culture and the decorative arts in the United States. To this day, it remains unique in offering students significant hands-on study of objects at the graduate level. Also, we are collaborating with Winterthur on the Winterthur University of Delaware program in art conservation, highly regarded as one of the best in the world. Faculty and students involved with the program have access to one of the country's largest and best equipped museums and analytical laboratories and conservation studios anywhere. We are truly fortunate to have a treasure like Winterthur in our area. But I know you didn't come to hear me wax on about the great things in Delaware and at the university. So now I'd like to introduce Chairman Adams. Before becoming chair of NEH, he was president of Colby College between 2000 and 2014, where he led a $376 million capital campaign, the largest in Maine history, that included the expansion of the college's art museum, creation of a Center for Arts and Humanities, and expanded the writing across the college's curriculum program, among many other things. He is a native of Birmingham, Michigan, and earned his undergraduate degree in philosophy at Colorado College, but not before taking a break to serve 3 years in the Army, where he served as an artillery officer for 1 year in Vietnam. An experience that he says helped motivate him to study and teach in the humanities. He earned his PhD from the University of California at Santa Cruz in the history of consciousness. And I just want to take a moment here to point out that we are very proud of our unique mascot, the Blue Hens, and he has actually 2 interesting mascots in his career as well. He has Santa Cruz, which are the banana slugs, which are almost as interesting as the Blue Hens, and Colby College, which are the white mules. Chairman Adams studied in France as a Fulbright scholar before starting his career in higher education, with appointments to teach political philosophy at Santa Clara University and at Chapel Hill. He later coordinated the Great Works in Western Culture program at Stanford and served as vice president and secretary of Wesleyan University before becoming president of Bucknell in 1995. Over the weekend, there was an excellent story about him in a Chronicle of Higher Education describing him as a very public intellectual. In his own words, the humanities are very closely connected to our values, our culture, our history, and our most important ideas. And he continues to reiterate that message as he supports and promotes the humanities through his work at NEH and on his national lecture circuit. We are very fortunate to have him spend time with us today, and I would like you to help me welcome Bro Adams, chairman of the NEH.
Thank you. It's so nice to be here. Thank you all for coming. I've been in Delaware twice, I think, both times as president of Bucknell, briefly in Wilmington, and equally briefly at Winterthur. And so it's great to come back and experience this place, and particularly some of its educational institutions and cultural institutions in a much deeper and more extended way. And I'm especially glad to be here with the Blue Hens, coming as I do from places with weird mascots. But good for you. And it wouldn't be the humanities without a few weird mascots around. Some other expressions of thanks to Provost Grasso for that nice introduction, to Marilyn Whittington of the Delaware Humanities Forum, its director, for being a part of this invitation to me, and most especially today here to Ann Artis, who worked very, very hard to make this trip happen and to make it as efficient and full as it is now. So, Ann, thank you very much. Especially, I want to thank all of you, and I want to thank the university for celebrating the 50th anniversary of NEH. This has been a big deal for us. It's been a big year for us. We've been celebrating since September 25th last year, all the way through next week, when we conclude this celebration at the University of Virginia. But this is one of the highlights of it, and I'm very grateful to all of you for being interested in what we do and being interested in our history. So today, I'd like to talk about 3 things and make sure especially that we have time to hear from you about what's on your minds. But first, I'd like to talk a little bit about NEH history and what's become of the agency over this 50 years. This is a story that's not told very often, so I want to tell it briefly because I think it's an important story. I want to talk, as Provost Grasso suggested, about the future of the humanities and about the future of NEH. The past is important for lots of reasons in itself, but it's also important as a platform for thinking about where we should be going and what we should be doing in the humanities and at NEH. And then, as I said, I'd like to hear your questions and thoughts about things I say and things perhaps that I don't say. I begin with a story leading into the history of the agency. Some of you will remember that there were presidential debates last fall, I think it was. It's hard to believe now that it was only last fall. It seems like forever ago. But in one of those debates, there was a moment that I must admit set me off, but it set me to thinking in a certain way about the agency and about the country. And it was in one of the debate settings with lots of candidates. I won't say which one, but you can tell from that lots of candidates, probably which one it was. And there was a moment in which one of the candidates for the presidency made a very seriously negative comment about philosophy and philosophers. Do any of you remember this moment? And he developed this invidious comparison between philosophy and philosophers on the one hand and welders on the other. I have to say, right at the beginning, I have immense respect for welders and for welding. But I was a little bit taken aback by this expression, in which he said quite clearly, we need many fewer philosophers and many more welders. I thought a lot about that phrase and the sort of smile that was on his face as he said that. And I thought about why I thought it was so utterly wrong-headed. And it seemed to me that it creates or expresses certain really deep ironies that have to do both with the founding of the country and the founding of NEH. Some of you know, because you lived through it, that in May of 1964, President Lyndon Johnson traveled to Ann Arbor, Michigan, where he delivered the commencement address there, a very brief address, but one that has become justly quite famous, because it was in that address in Ann Arbor in May of '64 that he enunciated for the first time the notion of the Great Society. And it was from that notion of the Great Society that all the incredible things that happened over the next 4 years of his first and only administration, that this idea of the Great Society played out in this extraordinary legislative agenda that included so many of the things we admire today. All of it organized around a single great question, and one of the truly great questions in the history of philosophy. What is the good society? It begins really philosophical reflection in the West with Plato and Aristotle asking that question. How ought we to live? What is our common purpose? What is the common good? And of course, that question, what is the good society, was in many ways the central question in the founding of the American Republic. Those individuals involved in the founding were, of course, in many ways asking that question, not only asking it, but giving answers to it. Hence the irony of seeing a presidential candidate belittle philosophy and, in the course of it, I think, belittle that kind of thinking for and in the country. The Great Society and the NEH came together on September 29, 1965, when Johnson signed the National Foundation on the Arts and Humanities Act in the Rose Garden on a brilliant fall day. And from that point on, the agency was off and running, along with its sister agency, the National Endowment for the Arts, which is, we are twins, I like to say, separated at birth, but working in very much the same ways to create the same goods for the country. The rationale that was put forward to the Congress that passed that legislation really had four elements. The first had to do with the fact that the United States had emerged from the Second World War as the great world power. And this was a new experience for the United States. The great military power, the great economic power. And there was an argument put forth by the founders and those who were supporting the creation of these agencies that we couldn't afford to be just a great power in economic terms and in military terms. We had to be a great power with respect to the culture that we had built over time and that we were intending to and should be intending to preserve and to share with all Americans. So great power, great culture, those things go together. They have to be thought about together. The second, and one that is still hugely relevant, I think, is the notion that the country must be committed, the state must be committed to the preservation of the historic and cultural legacy of the country. It's not enough for there to be great public universities like this one, working on that cultural and historic legacy. The country itself must be committed to that in a symbolic and also material way. And so it was in the thinking of those who founded NEA and NEH. The third leg of this stool, also very important, is the whole argument from democracy, that to maintain a strong democratic political culture in this country, we have to be in touch with our history. We have to advocate for our history and for historical understanding. We have to advocate for the understanding, the general understanding, the public understanding of the principles of liberal democracy. And we have to be understanding of and engaged with the cultural complexity, the cultural traditions that compose the country, and that have, of course, become much more complex over time, especially recently. And last but not least, I think there was an understanding, as there was with the founding of the National Science Foundation, that humanities research and humanities knowledge matter. They matter for the good of the country, they matter for the good of the people, and therefore the state there too must have a material and symbolic commitment. So since that founding moment, NEH has made 63,000 grants. That's a lot of grant making. That's a lot of applications and a lot of reading. $5.3 billion in funds distributed just from NEH. NEH has done another roughly $5.3 billion, so close to $11 billion in total, leveraging many, many millions more because a lot of these grants were matching grants and challenge grants. 40,600 grants to colleges and universities, $2.7 billion over that same period of time in grants to colleges and universities. And I'm very pleased to say and proud to say in front of this audience that the University of Delaware has done very well in this highly competitive environment. 161 grants since 1965, totaling roughly $10 million. And among those very recent grants, of course, these exemplary projects that the provost mentioned, the Next Generation PhD Implementation Grant. This is a brand new program of the NEH. Delaware was one of the first public institutions, one of the first institutions of any kind to receive such a grant. And they are now leaders, you are now leaders, in this effort to change graduate education to evolve with the circumstances in which we find ourselves. The Colored Conventions Grant, as you also heard from the provost, and very recently, a chairman's grant, a special chairman's grant to fund the cultural delegation to Cuba that Deborah Hess-Norris will lead to go to Cuba in just a couple of months in November. This grant came about as a result of a cultural delegation to Cuba, which I had the pleasure and honor to represent NEH on. It included David Skorton of the Smithsonian and also Jane Chu, the chairman of the NEA. And it led to this voyage that Deborah will take with her students from Delaware and that extraordinary program that you have here. What's been the effect of all this grant making and all this work over time? I think NEH unarguably has had a huge impact on the quantity and the reach and the quality of humanities research in the country. There's no question that we've been over that time the biggest funder of humanities research over this 50 years, and it's had a huge influence on the field. We have been involved centrally through those grants and many others in big changes and extraordinarily important changes in humanities fields and focus. We were very much there at the beginning of the creation of the field of African American studies. We were very much there at the beginning of the creation of area studies, including things like Latin American studies, and last but not least, also gender studies as they have evolved over the recent years particularly. We have also been involved in strengthening hundreds of humanities organizations around the country through endowment gifts that we have made over these 50 years to all kinds of institutions outside and beyond the academic world. And through that, we have been very involved in strengthening what I like to call the humanities ecosystem in the United States, which is an extraordinarily important and extended cultural resource for the country. Last but not least, I think NEH has been important as a symbol. It has symbolized the importance of our cultural and historical legacy in the United States and the public caring for and advancement of that legacy. And it has symbolized the importance of the ways of knowing and understanding the world that are represented within this broad concept or practice of the humanities. So in those ways, I think this organization has more than exceeded the promise that its founders saw for it in 1965, and it has been a hugely important and productive investment for the country. Of course, there have been enormous changes at NEH since 1965. There have been enormous changes in the country, and there have been enormous changes in the humanities. I want to talk just a little bit about each of those areas. At NEH, there has been a huge, steady turn from a very narrowly research-oriented organization in 1965 when we started out in the first grants over the first 6 or 7 or 8 years were primarily research grants. From that kind of organization, very much mimicking, I would say, National Science Foundation, we have become a much more broadly extended organization, deeply committed to all kinds of humanities programming in the public realm, through museums, through libraries, and historic sites. One wonderful fact that I like to throw out as we talk about the museum community: more people go to museums every year in this country than go to all professional sporting events and theme parks combined. I like that too. I have nothing against professional sports or theme parks, but the museum community in this country is enormous, and it is deeply engaged in its audience, its public audiences, and it is very effective in gathering those audiences together. Historic sites, libraries, as I mentioned, there are something like 120,000 libraries in the United States, many of them in educational institutions, but many of them not. And there are many different kinds of libraries, research libraries, public libraries, all kinds of libraries doing all kinds of interesting public work, and we've been involved with that too. Some of you know that we have a very deep and have developed a very deep practice in radio. We've developed a very deep practice in public television, particularly through our documentary filmmaking. 15 films of Ken Burns. We were Ken Burns' very first funder. His most recent film, The Roosevelts, was seen by 32 million people in its first week of airing on PBS. And Ken, of course, is still busy at work with our money and other people's money. He's coming out, by the way, you'll be eager to see this, a spectacular film, which I've seen cuts of, on the Vietnam War. This will be out in the fall of 2017, just about a year from now. It will be a hugely important public event. So scholarship, colleges and universities, museums, libraries, historic sites, documentary filmmaking, radio, and most recently, some of you might be horrified to hear this, some of you might be happy, digital games. I went to a digital gaming conference in New York a couple of weeks ago where some of our awardees were featured. This is an enormously interesting and exciting zone of humanities creation and productivity now. Game makers making games, nonprofit games, for public school, mainly public school children and teachers on important themes in American culture and history. We just recently funded a game on Walden, Henry Thoreau's voyage, internal voyage, at Walden. I've seen pieces of that, and it too is enormously interesting. And I think there's huge promise in digital gaming and all other expressions of the digital humanities. The humanities, of course, have also changed very, very quickly and profoundly over this period of time. You know, in 1965, when NEH was founded, I would say the dominant paradigm of humanities work in the United States was the paradigm imagined by Matthew Arnold when he talked about the best of what has been thought and said, that kind of deeply historical look, very powerful way of looking at things, but deeply historical work, built upon the notion of a canon, right? A set of classic texts which everybody should read, everybody should know. There wasn't a lot of disagreement about what those texts were. I would say a lot of things were left out of that canon, and that's an important part of the story since. But it really was a very conventional, very classical notion of the humanities that was present in the world and dominant at places like this in 1965. Of course, that paradigm has been exploding ever since that point in time. We have now engaged the humanities in almost every dimension of culture that is imaginable. Humanists are scurrying around, looking and talking about almost every cultural expression that one can imagine. And we now understand culture in a much different way. We have a much more deeply ethnographic, anthropological view of culture, and we're much more interested in the ways culture shapes our behavior and our lives as human beings in their everyday settings and contexts. With that expansive notion of culture has come, of course, an erosion of ideas of highbrow culture and lowbrow culture. We're not as inclined as we used to be to engage in that distinction. We've also seen over this period of time an incredible rise in the interest of humanists in theory, the theory of culture, the theory of literature, the theory of the humanities generally. This has been, I would say, a contentious evolution in some ways, and there are people who have been highly critical of the theoretical turn in humanities work, but it has certainly been a noticeable development in the history of the humanities over this 50 years, as have been two subsequent and very much related aspects of this change: the erosion of the idea of a canon, and even, of course, the erosion of the idea of the text. Again, there is great disagreement about these evolutions, but it is certainly part of the terrain that we inhabit. Last but not least, the country has changed enormously. We have seen since the Vietnam era, and this is all part of our current mix of pressures and difficulties, the delegitimation of the state as a trusted agent of the public good. We don't have to turn our television on very long at night to see this coming up in the current election season. As part of that change in the way people view the state has withdrawn. I don't need to tell you this. The state has withdrawn from higher education, and it is no longer clear to many agents of the state that this deep commitment to culture that was expressed in the creation of NEH is still worth preserving. We have seen the rise and triumph, most recently in the last decade, of STEM and the digital as zones of competition, in some sense, with the humanities. And we have also seen, again, in a related way to some of these developments, a tremendous rise in the cost of higher education, which has had a huge impact on the way people think about the humanities, about science, about technology, and about the public university. So after all this change, where are we now? And what are the future prospects? NEH right now, just so you know, is a $120 million agency. That's the grant budget that we have this year, about $120 million. That is one half of it was what it was in 1995, before the culture wars in the Gingrich Congress, which slashed our budgets by about 50% along with NEA. We are deploying that $120 million over research, over preservation, education, the public humanities, the digital humanities, challenge grants, which most recently supported the work here in graduate education, and our state and federal appropriations, which go to organizations like the Delaware Humanities Forum. We remain, I think, an important symbol of the national commitment to the humanities with a substantial legacy of achievement, but nevertheless periodically at serious risk of attack in the federal budgetary context and in Congress, with uncertain prospects, I would say, in the future. I don't say that in an alarming way. I think it's obvious to anyone who watches what's happening in Congress and watches us, but it is certainly a part of the world in which we live. The humanities now, thinking more broadly beyond the agency to the humanities generally, the work that all of you are doing, is a zone, a terrain, I think, of contradictions and ironies. And the contradiction has to do with the co-presence, I think, in our current work in the humanities of both adversity and important successes. The successes are significant, and they affect both the public humanities and the academic humanities. I mentioned before, in the public humanities, how extensive is this world of museums and libraries, historic sites, and how big an impact those organizations have on public consciousness. I mentioned the effect that somebody like Ken Burns has, that 32 million people are watching this very long documentary, long-form documentary on the Roosevelts is, I think, kind of astonishing. And the other digital media expressions that we are supporting are certainly powerful in their impacts as well. In the academic humanities, too, there are also wonderful things happening. There is a vitality and reach and breadth and ambition and excellence in the research zone that I think is enormously impressive and interesting. Public scholarship has become a much more active part of the way the academic humanities are thinking about their work, and I think there are very exciting things happening there. And last but not least, there is a lot of innovation in the humanities, particularly in the digital humanities and the use of digital technology to advance the interests and work of humanists. But there is also significant adversity. There is substantial pressure on the humanities in every single educational setting in this country, whether we're talking about primary, secondary, higher education, or graduate education. There is not a place where the humanities are not under significant pressure. The indicators of that are familiar to you. They are enrollments, they are majors, they are ways in which we've changed the accounting in higher education that is now much more sensitive not to the global aspirations we have for education and educational systems and institutions, but for a very narrow form of cost accounting that predominates in most universities and colleges in this country, and which has hurt the humanities significantly. And finally, the pressure is showing up in the dwindling number of teaching positions and the prospects for graduate students coming out of graduate programs for teaching positions across the country. So it is also a time of very significant adversity for all of us. The irony of all of this, to me, is precisely this. Even as this pressure builds, and even as we experience it in very particular ways in our settings, we as a country are besieged by challenges that require humanities understanding and knowledge. Think of the headlines and think of what we're reading about every day. This enormously interesting controversy that information technology has given to us, one of its gifts to us, is this very powerful argument about liberty and security and the rights of individuals to privacy and how that plays out in this very complicated environment where political entities collide with corporate entities, or not collide, but conspire with corporate entities, as some people would view it, and all of the permutations of that very complicated, deeply interesting debate. I've been following very closely, as many of you have, the fascinating news that's coming out of the gene editing world, particularly this new technology that is called CRISPR-Cas9, which now has given us as human beings complete control over the human genome. E.O. Wilson calls this the most profound event in human history. And, you know, I think there's an argument for that. You might have your candidates, and I certainly have mine, but it's an enormously powerful and interesting and deeply complicated issue that raises all kinds of fundamental questions of values. The issues CRISPR-Cas9 raises are not technical issues. We've got the technology. We can make these changes. We can control the human germline in virtually any way we want now. But that raises all of these other questions about what should we do, what do we want to do, what serves the common good of the country, of the globe, and everything else. Speaking of the globe, we're all aware of the enormous pressures on the environment and all of the very interesting questions this raises for humanities people and everybody. I read an article just the other day in the New York Times, and I'm sure Delaware is very sensitive to this, about the effects of global warming on sea level and all of the encroachments this is making in places like Delaware, Washington, D.C., Miami, Florida. We're funding a project down in Miami about global warming, the changes in Miami's cityscape that are being caused by this flooding, and how communities and neighborhoods are talking about that as a matter of policy and of public values. We are living in a society, a post-war society, which is struggling with all kinds of hugely difficult questions about the legacy of war and conflict, the legacy of war and conflict for the country as a whole, and what it's done to us as a society, but also the legacy of war and conflict for those who have been involved in those wars. We have not taken great care of them. How we re-engage these individuals in the life of the society is a very vexed question, particularly when most of the society no longer has an investment in military life and institutions. To most of us, most of the time, these are enormous abstractions. We are living through a very problematic period with respect to race and race relations in the United States. Delaware is a place where this is of some significant public consciousness. It is an issue for you. It's an issue for the entire country, but it's certainly an issue for you here in Delaware. And boy, if there was ever an issue that needed humanists deployed around it It's the question of race and race relations, particularly by way of history and the meaning and the legacy of history in this country. And last but not least on my list of grand challenges, you will have more, is the whole question of the fundamental health of our democratic political culture. I don't look at this election season with a whole lot of confidence with respect to our democratic political culture and its fundamental health, and there too, the humanities are fundamentally important. So, last but not least, and I will close with this, what is to be done about all this? I think there are some things that we should do in higher education right away that are important, difficult, but still need to be thought about. I think it's time that humanists very deliberately and much more powerfully than we have recently re-engage the public realm and speak about the public realm in publicly accessible ways in our research. I think we need to relearn how to talk to the public about things of public significance. The array of things, as I've been saying, is vast and amazingly interesting. There's plenty there for most humanists I know, and the methods and forms of understanding of the humanities. But it is something that we should consider very seriously taking up in a new and more powerful way. I think, secondly, we need to reconceive and restructure the undergraduate humanities curriculum at places like Delaware. I think we need to de-emphasize specialization, and I think we need to uncouple the ways we think about graduate education and undergraduate education. For a very long time, the graduate school curriculum has driven the undergraduate school curriculum in the humanities. I say this as a veteran of administrations in colleges and universities. I know this to be the case. I think it's unfortunate because I think that specialization has driven the undergraduates into the undergraduate curriculum into places that our students struggle to embrace. I also think it's time to take up in a brand new way the integration of the humanities with the STEM fields and social sciences. We talked a little bit about this today at Delaware State. I think there are enormously interesting opportunities to integrate the humanities with STEM fields and the social sciences, and I think we ought to be trying that in new and more energetic ways. And last but not least, I think we should be trying more energetically to teach the grand challenges, to teach these vexing social issues as sort of the core, the kernel of a reorganized undergraduate humanities curriculum. I think our students will gravitate toward those efforts, and they will also affect the way we think about teaching. I also think we need, and this will not become as any news to anybody here, to reconceive and restructure the humanities graduate curriculum, which is being done here, to de-emphasize specialization and to broaden the aperture of the way we think about career preparation for humanities graduate students. Delaware is now going to be a leader in this conversation across the country, and we're very eager to see how it turns out. Last but not least, I think we need to change very dramatically the way we conceive of secondary education in the United States. We need to move beyond the consuming preoccupation with the vocational and with STEM. We need to drastically reduce the testing regime. And most importantly, I talked about this a little earlier today, we need to re-engage this idea of the whole person and education for democracy. We're doing our best at NEH to develop programs and grant lines that will support these kinds of initiatives. And stay tuned, there will be more of these changes at NEH because we want to be your allies and partners in these changes in higher education and in secondary education to some degree as well. But most of all, what I want to leave you with is the notion that across the entire educational spectrum, I think we need to re-engage and reconstruct the argument for liberal learning as opposed to technical education, as the key to democracy, citizenship, and work as well. And I say this because the humanities, I think, are by definition tied to the concept and practice of liberal learning. I don't think they make sense, or they don't make sense in the fullest possible way outside of that context of liberal learning, and that without the widespread practices of liberal education, the humanities will be marginal to the educational enterprise. Our work, I think now, those of us who care about the humanities, is to demonstrate why liberal learning remains the best and most powerful preparation for life in contemporary society. And to do that, we have to overcome a couple of obstacles. The history of the liberal arts and of the ideal of liberal education is, in fact, principally an elite history. This is a notion that was developed to lead the educational practices for elites and leaders. Outside of the academy, I think that elitist resonance persists. We haven't connected convincingly the argument for liberal learning to the broad public sphere, and we haven't connected it meaningfully to the world of work and the professions. I also think that notions and discourse of technological literacy and work readiness have displaced anchoring concepts of civic virtue and education for citizenship. So, we need to reestablish, I think, the ideal of liberal education at the heart of all of our educational practices. And we need to rework the concept of liberal learning in ways that are particularly well suited to contemporary life. I'm going to cheat a little bit in closing by talking about the work of Danielle Allen, a political philosopher at Harvard, as she describes this work of recasting liberal education in four spheres. The first sphere she talks about is the professional sphere. How do the forms of knowledge and intellectual capacities and habits of mind nurtured by the humanities contribute to professional life and the world of work? In the cultural sphere, how do the forms of knowledge and habits of mind and thinking advanced by the humanities contribute to cultural competency and literacy, both locally and globally? In the political sphere, how do the forms of knowledge and habits of mind cultivated by the humanities contribute to citizenship and what Danielle calls participation readiness? And last but not least, in the existential sphere, or what she calls the existential sphere, how and why are the humanities essential to the search for meaning and the establishment of a meaningful human life? We have access to really important materials in all of these spheres, but we lack practiced and compelling answers that will resonate at all levels of education, not just in elite higher education. Secondary education is key here. I think if we don't get it right there, it will be hard to get it right in higher education. But the stakes are high and multidimensional. The stakes are very high in the cultural realm and the cultural challenges we face as a country. The stakes are very high in politics, the political realm, and democratic political culture. And I think the stakes are also high in science and technology with respect to how those domains impact us in everyday life and the questions of value and the questions of meaning that science and technology almost inevitably raise. Now that's a lot and pretty stern stuff. But I would leave you with this hopeful thought that even in this stressful time, and as I travel about the country to all of these states and territories, I am buoyed by the incredible richness that I see in the humanities community, both in the academic sphere and in the public sphere. And I'm buoyed by the incredible richness of this agency, which has done such extraordinary work over this 50-year period. And I'm buoyed by what I see, particularly in places like the University of Delaware. So I thank you for the opportunity to see what you're doing specifically, and I thank you for this memorable occasion in which you celebrate this very interesting and important history of the National Endowment for the Humanities. Thank you very much.
They should have us mic'd.
Are we on? Are we mic'd? Are we up? Yeah, I think so.
Well, please join me again in thanking Chairman Adams for a very stimulating, this entire visit has already generated a lot of email chatter among the people that have met with him so far, and it's just truly an honor to have you here and to know that the conversations that you've sparked will be sustained once you're gone. So
Thank you.
Join me in thanking him again. I'm wearing two hats in this role, having worked on getting him here for 18 months, and I want to start actually.
Sorry.
I want to start actually by giving students a chance to ask questions. I do have one of the things that occurred to me. I want to talk to you a little bit about Ken Burns and the history of Delaware and what he spoke about in his Jefferson lecture this year. But students, show of hands for all the graduate students in the office. Help Chairman Adams understand, and undergraduates. A few. Okay, either undergraduates or graduate students, please, you get a first chance to ask questions. Scott will be here at this mic, and we've got one more mic on this side as well. Don't be scared.
Hi.
Cesar, president of our graduate student government. Physics
How
candidate.
appropriate.
Will finish his dissertation this year.
A lot of things I was thinking I was not going to say, so thank you. I really appreciated the need that you communicated about expressing the value of the liberal education to the mass populace, I would say, and not just the so-called elites. But one concern that I have is in maintaining the balance of what has sort of been the historic discipline of the humanities and maintaining sort of these academic standards of sort of discipline-based inquiry that we kind of now have, and thinking about the traditional models of graduate education with sort of this broader base and digital humanities sort of component about reaching out to the populace and being involved with communities. So I guess the question I have is, how do you perceive this balance going forward between sort of community-based and public engagement-based inquiry and involvement with the humanities intellectually at the academic institution level with, I would say, what is more traditional of a model for graduate education?
I get asked that question a lot, as you might guess, and I think I'm really profoundly convinced that there is not, in the end, a competition there, and that those two things are not incongruent in a fundamental way. I was a creature of, in many ways, that traditional academic model, though I went to a very non-traditional graduate school. But I understand that deep, focused humanities discipline of learning. But I don't think that that's inconsistent with a more public-facing and publicly engaged sense of the humanities. And I think we've got to move in that direction to some degree if we are going to be true to the prospects of our graduate students, for one thing. I mean, you know, graduate students here know, that there are a lot of challenges in the professions, the humanities professions, in the traditional academic sense in the world. And those challenges are not going to go away, I don't think. So we have to think differently about the way in which we're educating doctoral students. And we have to be willing to give them more kind of professional opportunities than the traditional model has done in the past. So places like Delaware and lots of other places now in the country, we gave 3 implementation grants, but we gave another 25, I think, planning grants. Graduate programs all over the country are starting to walk down this road. And the ways in which they do it will be very, very different. And it will have to do with local circumstance, it will have to do with the fields, it will have to do with the combination of faculty and students who are in those places. And I don't know what those things will look like, I've got to say. But we're sort of feeling our way toward this new paradigm. And it will take a lot of experimentation and a lot of innovation and a lot of patience to get there. But I think it's hugely important. I would like to see more of the doctoral students, the actual PhDs that we have, be capable of engaging a variety of public domains where the humanities, I think, are hugely important. This university has a lot of experience with the museum world, And the institutional placement of graduate students beyond the academy in museums and libraries and places like that, those are rich but fairly well-known opportunities. I'd like to see us work our way into the next realm, the next part of this. Some corporations are now starting to hire anthropologists, ethnographers, to help them understand issues of corporate culture, which are hugely significant. I mean, the business world really does understand the importance of culture, I think. I don't know what all the outcomes will be, but I think these new kinds of initiatives are important to experiment with. And again, I don't think there's, in the end, incongruence between these two things. I think we just have to find our way through the complexities.
Someone from the Colored Conventions Project should actually speak to that point, because I'm thinking about the language you used last night, Gabrielle, the volunteers, the way that students, undergraduates and graduate students working on that project with you are working hand in hand with AME church members on the transcriptions of the Colored Conventions documents from the 19th century. So I see Lynette Overby sitting in the audience as well. We have a brand new Institute for Community Engagement. And thinking about community-based research, thinking about what it means to be not simply serving public audiences, but actually partnering with public audiences who have bodies of knowledge that we don't have, that aren't part of the academic culture history. I mean, there's an opportunity there to really imagine a relationship with a broader public where you're working with a partner who has a different expertise than you do, and you're both learning together. I mean, that's part of the vision for graduate education here through the Colored Conventions Project, certainly.
Good example.
Ken Burns, I learned last night we met in ICE Lab last night with Colored Conventions Project members and NEH Next Gen groups. And I learned last night that there was a whipping post in Newark until very recently. One of the students doing research on that project is interested in the history of corporate punishment and corporal punishment, police punishment in this state. Ken Burns, some of you have heard the Jefferson Lecture. He grew up in this city. He grew up in a neighborhood just south of the stadium, and in that lecture last spring told an incredibly powerful and poignant personal story about literally crossing the tracks to say goodbye to the African-American woman who had worked with his family while his mother was dying. And he was moving with his parent, or his dad, and his sibling to Michigan, actually. And he refused to give this woman a hug goodbye. So the past is never dead. It's never even past. History is complex and sometimes ugly. Your point earlier about race in particular, can you talk a little bit with this group about your conversation at DSU today, about the historical meaning of the HBCUs in a 21st century context and social justice issues, and everything you were saying today resonated with our conversations yesterday about a history of educational justice work in this state. But I've said too much, but there's so much.
It's something that's always on my mind, and I don't approach this issue as an expert. In fact, one of the great parts of the experience of being at NEH is to have learned a great deal more than I knew about the history of race and race relations in the United States, and to have been exposed to institutions like this one, like others who are deeply immersed in this history, and seeing all over again how hugely important reappropriating and recovering that history is to the ways in which we approach the contemporary situation in which we find ourselves. Without history, without that history, and without a kind of re-immersion and a re-engagement in it, it's very hard to imagine how we get through this moment, this extended moment that really started, in my mind, with Ferguson. And I I also am mindful of the fact that, we're celebrating right now the 150th anniversary of what's called the Second Founding, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And that whole history and process is very relevant to this current experience of race in the country that we're having. So the public stakes of this are very, very high. And we need people who can be public historians and help everybody think about this in a way that's illuminated by sort of looking again at that history, going back and thinking about it again. Because its meaning keeps changing as we change and as the experience and situation changes. So my hat's off to people who are doing this work in the world. And it's one of those places where I think you see in a very powerful, immediate way how critical this kind of humanities practice is. Ken does a version of it with his filmmaking. But there are lots of people doing lots of different things. We're supporting a project in Baltimore, the Maryland Humanities Council. In Baltimore, community engagement and conversations around the particular narrative and stories of race and race relations in Baltimore. It's happening in a couple of other places around the country with grants that we've put out in this Humanities in the Public Square grant line. But it involves schools, it involves educational institutions, it involves community organizations of all kinds. And it's a very significant way, I think, in which the humanities can and should play themselves out now in this country.
Yes, Gabrielle.
I wanted to thank you. I wanted to thank you for the ways in which you wove together questions of museums, of critical inquiry and decoupling professional training from humanities training for undergraduates in order to animate a kind of engagement and excitement and curiosity with ideas rather than a pragmatic approach to careers and professionalism in an economically depressed and constricting moment, particularly for students. And to say a little bit about partnerships, Anne, since you invited us to talk about that. I think we've been incredibly humbled at the Colored Conventions Project at how hungry the public is to engage as partners in historical inquiry. And this connects, it seems to me, to the questions you raised in relationship to museums because of the scattered archives or repositories and the ways in which African American history can be scattered among all kinds of different archives because it wasn't preserved because of the ways in which races devalued the artifacts and material objects and histories of people of color in relationship to elite museums that preserve them. And so we've had so many people come out of nowhere, right? There's a wonderful Civil War enactment colored regiment group in New York City who has been in touch with us, and they found one of the conventions which was in the city that they engaged their enactments in, and they transcribed that convention. We had somebody in Kew in England who discovered the Iowa conventions, the two 55 and 57 Iowa conventions, the only records that there are, full records that he found in Kew, and photographed those and brought them to us. So it seems to me that the kind of larger projects of recovery require exactly what you're talking about, right? Both an engaged public that has to be nurtured and supported in some way, and also that outreach from universities to larger publics to invite them to be partners in the recovery of history. And then the kind of hours. Denise, who's sitting right here, literally gets up at 7 a.m. sometimes when people call her so that they can get support to transcribe minutes because some of them are older and haven't engaged these technologies. And so she's gotten up very early in the morning in order to do that work with them. So I'd love for you to talk a little more about the interstices, right? The ways, whoops, that's not public humanities language. The crossroads, all right. The crossroads where the public, scattered histories and histories that have been marginalized, and museums and artifacts and repositories come together.
It's a very powerful intersection, interstice. And, you know, I know as a former university administrator and college administrator, colleges and universities are always wanting to find productive ways to engage their communities. And I think public history is a very powerful avenue for this. And humanists are getting better and better at it and developing skills both as humanists but also with their students. And so it's a tremendously rich vein to mine for colleges and universities. So I think it's hugely important. And I think you're right, you can't do it without engaging those publics, because that's where a lot of this material and a lot of these memories and stories exist. So they're critical to the long-term understanding of what particular topic you're trying to engage. Undergraduates respond to this stuff. I mean, I'm still close enough to that world to know that undergraduates respond to this, dare I say, modality of relevance. That word is so fraught in some ways, but undergraduates do respond to that. And good for them. I think that's terrific. The last thing I'd say is that, you know, I mean, I'm the first to lament the overemphasis on vocation and practicality in a kind of a vocational sense. But I don't underestimate the ways in which the humanities contribute to the preparation for careers. I mean, I think, as I said, I think we need to learn a language of talking about that's much more capacious and compelling. Because I think it's true, and I don't think you have to water down or dilute the sophistication and the depth of what we do to get there. You know, I've been a professional now in big organizations for a long time, and I know from experience how much these capacities that the humanities cultivate matter in organizational life. So we should be talking about that too. And those kind of skills that students get in the kinds of community work you're talking about are enormously important.
We have time for one more question. Anyone? Anyone?
The one in the back there.
Hi.
Lynette Overby.
Hello. Yeah. Hi. I'm Lynette Overby, and I've worked with Gabrielle Foreman, funded by Ann's Interdisciplinary Humanities Research Center, and actually using the arts as another means of uncovering stories. Her story of Harriet E. Wilson and Dave the Potter, and now we've done another project. But so just looking at how the arts and the humanities can work together in ways of bringing that knowledge, those dialogues to the public, and these were bringing racial issues. But my question is, with my other hat on as Deputy Director of our Community Engagement Initiative, because doing this kind of work does require time and effort, building relationships, understanding assets of the community, and then knowing how to present this as one would go forward for merit, promotion, and tenure, et cetera. And so I'm just wondering, is this something that has come up as you have visited other states and presented this message?
Comes up all the time, and I can tell you simply what I think about it. We need to change the tenure and promotion process in these institutions to accommodate these new forms of public humanities work, whether it is scholarship, essentially, that is more publicly motivated and addressed, or whether it is these more practical and community engaging sorts of work. At NEH, some of you know, we developed recently within the fellowship program, which has been the most important source of research grants over the last 50 years in the country, we've developed a new program called the Public Scholar Program. This is to encourage research projects aimed at final expression, final form, in a much more publicly accessible and widely targeted sort of work. We hope that affects the ways in which tenure committees and administrators, academic administrators, think about that kind of work because it's got the imprimatur of NEH attached to it now. We've also developed very recently, as part of that program, an incentive to humanities scholars to do that work in digital form, which is not for everybody, by the way, but it's certainly an avenue of expression that we need to legitimate in the public, in the tenure and promotion process. So both of those things are very relevant to research and to publication, but we also need to find a way to acknowledge and reward forms of work that are not narrowly expressed in scholarship of a very conventional kind, because it does take a lot of time. The questions aren't simple, but you know, we're smart people. We can figure this out. So I'm all in favor of really dramatic changes, and I should have mentioned it. It is one of the things that needs to change in the humanities universe to enable these other kind of more expansive changes, I think. I'm sorry if that upsets any academic administrators. I'm no longer an academic administrator. I can say these things.
Chairman Adams' next meeting is with recent NEH Grant Award winners from Delaware and Fulbright Scholars. You carry all kinds of prestigious awards in your own career. So he's headed off to Old College to meet with that group before the first folio exhibition. Some of you are trying to get to Michael Whitmore's lecture at the library, so we need to end this on time in order for folks to get to where they're going at 4 o'clock on time. But I hope we see you again. Chairman Adams will be making remarks at the opening around about 5:30, so you have time if you're interested in hearing Michael Whitmore, the director of the Folger, talk about the Shakespeare extravaganza that's happening nationally and starting here. And we'll see Chairman Adams next up in Old College as well. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much.
Join me in thanking him again.